Across the centuries, the search for truth has never ceased, and one mind still stands as a guiding light. Welcome to the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Reed. I'm Dr. Jason Reed, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Theology and Philosophy Department at Divine Word College Seminary. In addition to teaching seminarians and religious at Divine Word, I also teach those in formation for the Permanent Diaconate Program in the Archdiocese of Dubuque, offering courses like the Philosophy of God, Christology, Metaphysics, Epistemology, and Trinitarian Theology. Here, we walk in the footsteps of St. Thomas Aquinas, exploring the mysteries of existence, the nature of God, and the pursuit of wisdom that shapes the soul. That journey begins now. Welcome to episode 6 of the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed. I am Dr. Jason Reed, and the last episodes we've been looking at why should one study philosophy? And we made the argument based upon the scripture and just sound reason and the church's authority that the study of philosophy and the study of theology both go together. Right? The life of the mind and the life of faith, in a sense, are two different sides of the same life. Right? Just like there are two lungs, two wings, we need to have both. And so I talked a lot about how we need to be doing philosophy. But I've also been, I don't know if lamenting is the right word, but just sort of just talking about how just there's a real lack of training in philosophy around. There's just a lot of misunderstandings of philosophy. And how does one get started in it, right? So if I'm talking about what the church says, I mean, the church talks about the value, so that's what we've been talking about. It's just how valuable it is and how needed it is, how indispensable it is, and how it's required, and all these things. And that's all fine, and it's very important. But let's get down to it. How does one do this? How does one philosophize? How does one actually go about doing this thing called philosophy that the church is talking about being so indispensable? And so I thought it'd be really helpful, and I think very important, for the Thomistic Minds broadcasts to spend some time talking about logic. Because in my view, logic really is the stepping stone into doing philosophy. So to that end, let's get started in just a brief lesson or lessons in logic. So as a way of orienting our discussion on logic, I'm going to quote the very beginning of St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles. So the Summa Contra Gentiles is a series of volumes that St. Thomas wrote basically for missionaries. Right? How does one argue, philosophize for the truth of theism, and then how does one then establish the truths of faith? The Summa Contra Gentiles is Thomas wrote for that. And Thomas starts off with saying just what does it mean to be a wise man? What does it mean to be a wise person? So first he quotes Proverbs 8:7, "My mouth shall meditate truth, and my lips shall hate impiety." And then he says this, quote, "According to the philosopher," and when Thomas says the philosopher, he has Aristotle in mind. So according to Aristotle, "they are to be called wise who order things rightly and govern them well. Hence, among other things that men have conceived about the wise man, Aristotle includes the notion that it, quote, it belongs to the wise man to order," end quote. Of course, the title of this section that he's starting off with is called the office of the wise man, right? The office, the task, the duties, the characteristics of the wise man is to know order, end quote. And we'll come back to that, this idea of order. So what does it mean to be wise? What does it mean to order? What does it mean to order things rightly and govern them well? Well, that's kind of what logic's going to be about. But for many today, logic is unfortunately, it's a foreign language. And now it may sound familiar to those, say, who do computer programming or engineering. I know engineers talk about logic, software engineers, that sort of thing. But that's more mathematical logic. It's not necessarily traditional logic, right? Dealing with the nature of a syllogism, right? So although there are computer programming and software engineering who does talk about logic, there are actually very few colleges that offer traditional logic, and traditional logic is what I'm going to be explaining. There are few colleges that offer traditional logic anymore, and those that do offer it, it's not required unless you're a philosophy major. And even if you're a philosophy major, it's not necessarily required. And I was fortunate enough to go to an undergrad where logic was required. And here's maybe a piece of encouragement when it comes to logic. Logic isn't just hard for the non-philosopher. Logic takes work for everybody. And even in a certain sense, there are some philosophers who have difficulty with logic. And so when I was taking an undergrad course in logic, had a really nice instructor, and of course lots of them were science majors, they were computer majors, and obviously all the philosophy majors were in there. And I remember just how everyone struggled with, not everyone, how many people struggled with trying to understand, well, what is the instructor saying? Inference, antecedents, consequence, truth tables, like what's going on here? So yeah, logic does take work, but it can work, but it's not, again, my point is it's not necessarily just for the philosopher. Even the philosopher has a hard time. It's not just for the software engineer. Okay. So I was really glad that it was required for me. Moreover, for those who have heard of the study of logic, so one is very few people have heard the study of it. Very few people have encountered it. But there are some who have heard of the study of logic, but they have this misconception that logic is for those with the high IQ, right? The Einsteins, the Steven Pinkers, the Jordan Petersons, right? All these cultural, quote-unquote, intellectuals. They can study logic, but it's not for me, right? Logic for them, but not for me. Unfortunately. And so and that's just not true, right? Logic is obviously for everybody. Now, I do want to caution, nota bene, I want to caution the listeners about logic. Okay, logic must be distinguished from thinking, right? Logic is not the same thing as thinking, and you'll hear a lot of this happen in more everyday scenarios. We'll say, well, your logic is flawed. Well, what they're talking about is the thinking is flawed. That's not logic. Okay, logic is going to be a science. Logic is going to be an art. And so we talk about someone's being, well, your logic is flawed, or that doesn't make logical sense, or what they mean in that context, and what I'm meaning here in this show, these are different things. Okay, logic is not the same thing as thinking. Why? Because much, if not the dominant view of what constitutes logical thinking is something like this, right? So they think, well, here's logic. Logic deals with dis or misinformation. When they're thinking, I'm doing logic, I'm thinking about notions of credibility. Round tables where there's dialogue. I think there's how to debate YouTube videos where there is so-and-so versus 25 other so-and-sos. I think it's called Surrendered. Right? There are interviews. There are panels. You've got CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, even ESPN, right? You've got all these roundtables where people are discussing and thinking and dialoguing and giving their opinions and going back and forth. There is thinking going on there. It's not logic. Okay? That's not what logic is going on there. There's also more mundane thinking, like when you're pondering how to organize the basement. That's some thinking. Make a weekly family dinner menu. Who to call for help. Imagining if getting a different job is worth it. deliberating over the costs and benefits of staying up late and studying, or staying up late and having a cheeseburger, those sorts of things. That is thinking, and it's everyday thinking. It's not logic. Not logic. There's also, you go online, people will be sharing their doubts. There'll be challenges, questionings, giving opposite points of view, right? You have a lot of YouTube channels by apologists and of all stripes. There are skeptics on there and atheists on there, Darwinists on there, creationists on there, et cetera, et cetera. And so they'll share their doubts about something, or they're not convinced of something, and they want some clarity on something, and that's all fine and dandy. Those are all ways in which there's a lot of thinking going on, but that's not logic either. That's not logic, right? Logic is not just thinking. It's not dealing with credibility. It's not dealing with dialogue. It's not dealing with, people going back and forth. It's not, there's a lot of thinking when you're pondering this, pondering that, thinking about this, thinking about that. None of that is logic, okay? It's not logic. Although logic is embedded, right? There's logic going on there. But that's not what logic is, right? Logic is not the same thing as thinking. That is, you can't reduce logic to the processes that human peoples engage in, right? Of course, we process information. We mull things over. We think things through. We feel certain ways about things, so on and so forth. And again, that's all thinking, but that's not logic. Okay? Again, logic is not the same thing as the processes that we engage in to consider information, to sift through evidence, so on and so forth. None of that's logic. Although again, logic is necessarily tied to that. So if logic is not the same thing as thinking, if logic isn't just doubting and dealing with the mundane, and logic isn't just the same thing as us processing information, then what is it? Well, to probe logic, I think, deeper, let's just contemplate and meditate on the key word in the Aristotle quote that Thomas gives. It's a concept of order. Logic deals with order. Logic seeks order. Right? Logic orders, right? Logic doesn't just seek order. Logic is in the business of ordering, right? So then, of course, the question then becomes, what sort of order is logic, and where do we find the study of order, right? If logic is about order, logic studies order. If logic does ordering, well, then where do we find the study of order? Well, basically, every single human discipline is engaged in ordering. Every single discipline and investigation and all branches of study, they all engage in some way or another with order and ordering. So, for example, the natural sciences, they study order. They study patterns of order, but the patterns and the order that they study are patterns in order that is discovered. It's not made. So the natural sciences they seek to discover the order, the patterns found in nature, right? Biological order, order in physics, chemistry, the order in botany, the weather patterns, the solar system, the ecological system, right? Solar system, and those are ordered. There's an order to our genes and the DNA. There's the order in the laws of nature, so on and so forth, right? So the order studying the natural science is order that reason discovers, doesn't invent. Okay, what about the arts? Well, does the arts study order? Yes, arts study orders. It studies patterns, but it studies the order in the patterning that reason creates. And so in a word, the arts studies and seeks to create order, to make order. For example, there's the order we find in painting. Right? We have the color wheel, we have certain patterns that we use, there are shapes, shades, tones, the art of focusing, guiding the brush strokes, the laws of the types of canvas. We look for certain effects that flow from certain causes and conditions, right? So we are seeking in the painting to create the order on the canvas. And a perfect example, if you want to see what I'm talking about, watch a great painter who is also an entertainer, Bob Ross, right? The famous Bob Ross, right? He is seeking to put order on the canvas. So that's a study of order. There's also sculpting, where you make tools, you pick out the correct material for one's purposes that can hold the shape, so on and so forth. There's a great actual theologian down in St. Louis area named Dr. Lawrence Feingold, who was an atheist sculptor. And he's just got a great testimony. You can look up him on YouTube. I think he has his testimony often on there. And what he says as a sculptor, as an atheist, he said, I was sculpting and I was doing all this work to create beauty in my sculpting, but he found himself unable to create the beauty of the natural world. He said that the true beauty, the real beauty, was beauty I could not create. That is, it's interesting. He could not create the beautiful order in his sculpting that he saw in the beauty and the order of creation. And eventually he became a believer, and now, of course, he's a theologian. There's the order that we find in our poems. There's order that we find and we write music, which is very interesting, especially nowadays when talking about people wanting to come back to Mass. One of the things people complain about is music. But writing music or composing music, right? The verses, the chorus, the coda, the bridge, the time signature, all those things, right? Is you're ordering things. And for those of you that like Christian hymns, there is an order one finds in Christian hymns. Oftentimes, not all the time, the third out of the fourth verse, right? Verse 3 out of fourth verses, oftentimes, or many times, is the Christological verse. That is, the order that the composer is putting into the hymn is building it's building emphasis, it's building emotion, it's building anticipation, it's building desire in this process, and so that it completes that process in verse 3. Right? So what drives, it can be frustrating is that here you've got this hymn that's building towards verse 3. You can find yourself building towards it, and you get done with verse 2, and you're ready to go into verse 3, and the music stops. Everyone's walking out of the parish. It kind of drives me. It kind of bothers me a little bit if you can't tell. It just stops before the verse that's completed the process. And the point I'm making is that the order is like built in, getting me to go somewhere, and then I'm cut off. So that's unfortunate. But the same thing is also true in our liturgy, right? The liturgy is meant to be ordered. It's meant to be coherent. And so just a kind of a tangent here a little bit, that to the extent in which a Mass lacks order and consistency, the extent in which worship lacks order and consistency, it lacks coherency. And what happens with that coherency and that disorder? Well, that disorder and incoherence gets impressed on those in attendance. That is, our souls, right, the way that we're worshiping, that incoherence, that lack of order, right, gets impressed on those in attendance. That's why it's very important to have an orderly, rational, coherent, ordered liturgy, Mass, song, right? Okay, enough of the homily. But the point here is, and when it comes to the arts, it does seek to study order, but it studies order that reason creates, not that it discovers. Okay, then there are the moral sciences, right? There's morality. Or morality does study order. It seeks the patterns that reason prescribes, right? Natural sciences discover it, the arts produce it. That is, reason discovers, reason produces. Now reason is prescribing. Do this, don't do that. Believe this, don't believe that. And so that is, in the moral sciences, order, the pattern that we are seeking, is prescribed for obtaining the good and the beautiful, for example. So in law, you're seeking order, the order found in justice, the order that's found in fairness, correction, prevention, proportional punishments, proportional rewards. Right? It's about ordering a society. It's fair, ordering one's will to the good. It's helping us to order our wills away from evil, so on and so forth. So morality deals with prescription. Now, all ordering, whether it's discovered, produced, or prescribed, is rooted in reason. That is, to reason is to engage in order. And not to order is not to engage in reason. As a matter of fact, the more that you engage in disorder, the more you're engaging in disreason. In a word, irrationality. Irrationality is tied to disorder. So, and now that's not just me saying that. Pardon me, I got all excited there. It's not just me saying that. The critics of reason, critics of the use of reason, understand this quite well. How do I know that? Because critics of reason, they show their disdain for reason. They show their penchant for the irrational and the disordered. We see this in their views of nature. We see it in their art. We see it in their ethics. We see it in their movies, right? The theater. We see it in their music. That it's all governed by the irrational. Right? There are buildings that have stairs to nowhere. Plays, poems, songs, movies, and they have no point. There is no resolution. In a sense, there are no acts. It's not a 3-act play. It's not a 3-act movie. There's no theme. There's just no point. There's a famous play. I think it's by Beck. But don't quote me on that. There's a play where everyone comes and attends. They sit down, and the play starts off like this. The curtain opens up, and you have all the actors just standing there, not moving. And then in unison, they do this for some duration. I don't know if it's maybe a minute or so, but it doesn't matter if it's a minute or 2 minutes. It sounds like it lasts for eternity. And then the curtains close. And what's the point? The point is that there isn't a point. The point is that there is no meaning, that all there is to life is it's just you're just passing the time. You're not going anywhere. You didn't come from anywhere. You are the product of a chance event in a meaningless universe. And so they just think, they think ultimately that is critics of the use of reason see that if I'm going to give up reason, I have to embrace the irrational. And so some of them think that's just the nature of reality. Reality is kind of irrational. Now, of course, long term, no one lives that way, right? Reason will keep coming back. Why? Because even those who deny that we should be guided by reason, they think that's the reasonable thing to do. They think that's the logical thing to do. That is, people who give up reason, who embrace the irrational, right? They're still at some level using logic and using order in order to base the irrational. For example, like the buildings they make, right? Well, the buildings they make have to follow the logic and the rules of architecture and physics and construction, right? If you're going to frame this stair that goes to nowhere, well, you've got to make sure you follow the principles of construction and contracting, right? That is, so again, you can corrupt reason, but you can't just get rid of reason, is the point I'm making here. So I'm using the critic of reason to show that the critic of reason gets that if you embrace reason, you have to embrace order. So all ordering, whether you're discovering it, producing it, prescribing it, is rooted in reason. Even the critic understands that. But as we have discussed over the last few weeks, the one God is a God of order. The triune God is a God of order. Right? The Son of God, as the Word, right? John 1:1. The Son of God is the Word proceeding from the Father. In what order? The Word precedes the Father, right? The word for word is logos. And this is God's reason, ratio, idea. And so the Word proceeds from the Father in the order of intellectual emanation. That is, the Word is generated by the Father by an intellectual operation. The Son is literally the ratio Dei. He is the reason, logic, idea, the ordering of God. And so the world is logical, the world is rational, and that means the world is ordered. Now, one of the things that the Thomistic mind wants you to understand, to have a Thomistic mind, is one must know what sort of order one is seeking, or one is discovering, or that one is studying. Right? It is the function of a wise person, a philosophically astute person, to know what sort of order is being sought. Is order, is it being discovered? Well, that's one way of studying order. Is it an order that's created? Then you're in the arts. Or is it a reason that is prescribing? And so each discipline, each way of order, each of the disciplines, right, seeks knowledge in different ways. Okay. So you're listening to the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Reed. If you've just joined us, you're listening to us talk about logic on the show, which you may have never heard that before. Hopefully you're excited about learning some logic and the ordering. And we just discussed in this first segment that many people don't understand logic, have heard of logic. They think that logic is just a certain kind of thinking. They think that logic is like being a serious thinker and thinking, pondering things through. Well, that's not true, right? Logic is not thinking. That is what I mean by that. It's not identical. Yes, logic is a kind of thinking. There is logic engaged in thinking, but you can't just say, well, I'm thinking, and therefore whatever I'm thinking, it's logic. That's not the case, right? Mulling things over, thinking about things, thinking about what to do, thinking about how to organize, asking questions, dealing with challenges, all those things are thinking. But they're not logic. Because what's logic? Logic is about the ordering of something. And of course, it's going to be about ordering our thoughts, that's for sure. But logic is the study of order. Logic is the study of order. It's not just thinking per se. It's a certain kind of order. It's a certain kind of structure. It's a certain kind of system. Right? And where do we see systems and order and patterns discovered and studied? Everywhere. Every single discipline studies order. Every single discipline studies sort of patterns. And so we've talked about the sort of patterns and order that you find in the natural sciences. You discover it there. We looked at this sort of order that's studied in the patterns in the arts. That is the order that reason creates. And then we looked at the sort of the ordering and the patterning that you seek in the moral sciences. That's the order that reason prescribes. And we just finished off with the Lord. And so now, after this next break, we'll have a break right now. We're going to look into what sort of order does logic study. Stay with us. The Church teaches that a solid education and grounding in philosophy is necessary to find the truth and avoid error, to understand the mysteries of divine revelation, to grasp the Church's doctrine, and to engage an unbelieving world. Philosophy is so valued by the Church that she requires it to form the intellectual life of her priests. Read Thomas is an online program created to make this intellectual formation more widely accessible. Developed and taught by Dr. Jason Reed, the courses combine academic rigor with a spirit of faith, presenting the great themes of classical and Thomistic philosophy in a way that is clear, structured, and faithful to the Catholic intellectual tradition. Participants encounter fundamental questions of philosophy through topics such as the pursuit of wisdom, an introduction to philosophy, an overview of philosophy's origins, methods, and enduring questions. There's He Who Is, examining the classical view of God's attributes and their theological and spiritual implications. We also have The Mystery of Existence, the philosophy of creation, exploring the metaphysical principles underlying the doctrine of creation. Then we have The Three-Person God, the mystery of God's inner life, a philosophical study of the Trinity's inner relations. There's also St. Thomas Aquinas' philosophy of the angels, where we consider the nature and role of spiritual beings in Thomistic thought, and further courses that engage the treasures of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Read Thomas seeks to cultivate not only knowledge, but also a deeper appreciation of the harmony between faith and reason, helping participants enter more fully into the wisdom of St. Thomas Aquinas and the Church's philosophical heritage. The website is www.readthomist.com. That's www.readthomist.com. The email is read.thomist@gmail.com. That's reed.thomist@gmail.com. At Read Thomas, we believe the life of the mind is for every Christian. Okay, we're back from the commercial, back from the break, and now we're going to start segment 2, of episode 6 on our brief and exciting journey into logic. And we ended last time talking about how logic seeks order, and all the different disciplines seek order, whether it be discovered as in the sciences, whether it be produced in the arts, or whether it be prescribed as in the moral sciences. And so what sort of ordering, what sort of patterns does logic seek? What is, in a word, what is the order found in logic? And here's the answer. The answer is this. If one looks at all the order sought in all those disciplines, one notices that one must use reason to discover, produce, create, prescribe. To engage in reason is to engage in order. Therefore, because the ordering involved is an ordering of thought and ideas, that's the key thing. All these sciences are dealing with some sort of ordering taking place in reason. So then what's logic? Logic is the study of order that is found in reason itself. Logic is the study of order, patterns, that are found in reason itself. That is, logic studies reason, not the processes that we go through information. It studies reason. How so? Well, what's the goal of reasoning? What's the goal of reasoning? And I'm just going to stipulate this, right? I'm not going to argue for it on the show. We can talk about this, I can defend that later. But the goal of reasoning is to find truth. The goal of reasoning is to find truth. Why? We reason in order to find the truth about what? To find the truth about God. To find the truth about love. To find the truth about goodness. The truth about beauty, malice, virtue, vice, on and on and on. And so logic is that branch of human inquiry that studies how reason is supposed to work. It studies reason as it is operating as an instrument to find the truth. Or another way of saying is that logic studies reason so that it can find the truth in the proper way. That is, there are certain patterns and orders that reason should follow, should have, if it's going to be an instrument to find the truth. And so logic, in a sense, is normative. Logic is normative, meaning it's thought guiding. It's thought directing. So logic guides and directs our thoughts. So again, it's normative. It's not just hardwired, right? That would commit the is-ought fallacy. We're not saying, well, logic is just something hardwired. No, normative deals with what should be, not just what is. So logic deals with what should be. So what sort of patterns and order should our reasoning have? And so if it's going to be normative, right, if it's going to be a normative science, well, it's going to have values that are using to make the normative judgments. That is, logic is going to use value concepts. It's going to use normative words and ideas that we use to judge and measure thinking. And so what words, what values does logic use? And so to that end, I just begin with some quotes or a few quotes from standard logic textbooks. And so I'll give you the quote, and then I'll tell you who said it, and then I'll comment on it. So this is from Irving Copey. So if you've ever taken a logic class or heard of logic class, if you go into almost any bookstore, and if there is a book on logic, it's probably Irving Copey's Introduction to Logic. It's a standard text. It's gone through a gazillion editions. Here's what he says. He says, logic is the study of the methods and principles used to distinguish good from bad reasoning. Good from bad reasoning. Or another way he says it, correct from incorrect reasoning. And so logic is going to look at when reason's operating, logic studies so that it can distinguish. That is, the study of logic will tell us and classify methods and principles that are incorrect and those that are correct. Now, it doesn't say much more in that. So there's this idea that logic distinguishes, right, separates good, correct, bad, incorrect reasoning. So there's a value judgment. So this is an objective feature. This is why, in a sense, logic is a science, not science in the classical sense. But logic is an instrument, right? That is, instruments should be used in a certain way. There are good instruments and there are bad instruments, right? How do we judge, say, hammers, right? We judge whether or not they can put the nail in the wood. So good and correct. So that's the first sort of attempt. So whatever good means, whatever bad means, logic is distinguished that when it comes to reasoning. Now, working off that, there's Howard K. Haynes' statement where he says logic attempts, again, to distinguish, says to separate, right, to make a distinction, to say two different types of things, between correct, and now he says valid. Distinguish correct or valid and incorrect or invalid arguments. So now we have a little more, some of the more to work with, right? So logic is attempting to what? Logic is going to study arguments. And some arguments are going to be, if an argument's valid, it's correct, whatever that happens to mean. And it's looking to see when an argument is incorrect. That's when it's invalid. So what's a good argument? A good argument is a correct argument, and a correct argument is a valid argument. So again, logic studies reasoning, what kind of reasoning, not thinking, the kind of reasoning that is constitutive of an argument. Logic studies the methods and principles of reasoning as found in the exercise of an argument. That's the idea. So logic is to distinguish, right, when arguments are valid, correct, invalid, incorrect. Then another philosopher, Antony Flew, says this about logic. He says, in its broadest sense, logic is the study of the structure and of reasoning or of sound argument. So now we've got sound in there. So you see, what's happening with these quotes is we're starting to develop, in a sense, a vocabulary, right? We're starting to, in a sense, like a glossary of our journey here, right? So you should be thinking about that, right? That logic has these concepts in it. It's got the idea of reasoning, argument, correct, incorrect, valid, invalid, and now sound. Now we have sound arguments. And of course, he doesn't say this here, but sound versus unsound. Okay, whatever those mean, whatever those mean, and we're going to be unpacking that. Well, I'm going to tell you what valid and invalid, tell you what an argument is, tell you what sound and unsound are. Whatever those are virtues and vices of reasoning. Okay? And so these arguments then become the instruments to either find truth in the proper way and avoid error in the proper way. Okay. Then there's my mentor, Norman Geisler. He defines logic this way. So this quote by Geisler kind of brings it all together. Okay, I like Norm's definition. He says logic is the study of right reason. I love that phrase, right reason, or valid inferences, and the relevant fallacies. There are formal fallacies, and there are informal fallacies. Beautiful. Thanks, Dr. Geisler. So logic then is a way to think. So it is a kind of thinking. But what distinguishes it? Logic, again, it's not identical to thinking, it's a certain type of thinking. Logic is thinking in such a way as to come to correct conclusions by understanding the idea of an implication. If you happen to be taking notes, if you want a part to remember, think about that, right? Logic is a way to think so that we can come to correct conclusions by understanding an implication, understanding an entailment. Right? Logic, in a way, tries to understand implications, entailments, inferences. That's the first thing. So correct implications, and then to avoid the mistakes that people make in thinking. In a word, when people think there is an implication, but there isn't. They think there's an implication, but there isn't. They think there's an entailment, but there isn't. They think there's an inference, but there isn't. Okay. So that's what logic is. Now, if that sounds like a lot, is that for me? Or is that just for the intellectual? Is that just for the scholar? Is that just for the professor? Well, I want to just talk about why you should study logic, like why these episodes that we're doing on logic, why this would be something in your interest, reasons to listen to what I'm saying. Well, first of all, you can't avoid logic. You just can't avoid logic, no matter what. Logic is everywhere. Logic is in every single thought you've ever had. Logic is in every single idea that ever was, is, and will be. Logic is literally unavoidable. The only way to avoid logic is just don't think. But in a way, not thinking, logic has something to say about that, right? Because logic says not thinking is not the same thing as thinking, right? So logic is literally unavoidable. It's literally undeniable. But also logic is grounded in reality. Logic is grounded in being, right? Logic is grounded in the way things should be. Logic is grounded in finding the truth. So that's why you should study it, because logic is grounded in reality. Again, think about John 1:1. That is, in a sense, logic is the very basis for being. Logic is the very ground and foundation for all reality. Next, logic works. Logic works. If you know how to make a good argument, then you can actually be persuasive. It does work. So I've taught logic for years, and I always bring out, there's usually a logic section in all the classes I teach, in particular if it's an intro class, like if it's introduction to moral philosophy or ethics, even philosophy of God, there's going to be a logic unit. And routinely, if someone who had had in class before saw me on campus years later, this has happened to me many times. They come up to me and they say, you know, of all the things we learned in whatever class that was, logic has helped me the most. Logic has helped me the most. I said, how's that? Because I'm able to make arguments. And of course they said my spouse is not crazy about it, that I can make these really good arguments. But logic works. They use it at their work, their place of employment. They've used logic to make arguments to help them get promotions, to deal with family troubles. I mean, they just use logic all the time. So that's one thing they're very thankful for. Our children, when they go to the university or the college, one of the things that we required for them is you have to take logic. I don't care if you're a philosophy major, and don't care about that in the slightest. Don't care if you're going to be a logician in the slightest. But what you do need is you need to have the tools in the tools of logic, right, in your back pocket. And so one of our children is a teacher, and she uses logic all the time, making arguments. And not only that, but she's seeing what she's seeing what logic says what you shouldn't do. So does she have all logic memorized? She doesn't have logic memorized. I don't know if she can actually tell you, what are the Latin names for the inference rules and the formal fallacies. But the shadow that her logical training casts is with her all the time. And so the reasons why you should study logic, just to recap, it's unavoidable. It is grounded in reality. It's grounded in being, right? That is, logic is the very foundation for all reality. And it works. Okay, but you may not be persuaded yet. You may have some objections to logic. So let's talk about some possible objections to logic. All right, one objection I've heard before is that whole traditional logic, you're just using Aristotelian logic. You're using that whole Western logic. Why not other kinds of logic? Okay, what about this charge that we're using Aristotelian or Western logic? Well, the response is to reject the question. Right? This is not about Aristotle's logic or Western logic. There's no such thing as Western logic. There is the logic that the West uses. There's the logic that the Aristotelian discovered. But Aristotle did not invent logic, and logic is not the property of the West. No, logic belongs to all human beings everywhere, right? I mean, the East, if you want to use Eastern logic, they believe in logic. They don't believe the law of non-contradiction. I mean, they believe the law of non-contradiction. They believe in making inferences. They make arguments. For example, people think that the Buddhist, right, because you've got Zen Buddhism, which denies certain forms of logical contradictions, and that could be, and I don't want to get into an argument over whether Buddhism positively embraces the absurd, but in Buddhist's own writing, right, Siddhartha Gautama, right, the founder of Buddhism, he gives a syllogism for why there isn't an enduring soul, and he uses the disjunctive syllogism, right? He says, well, if the Hindu is right, that if I look inside, right, I should find this unchanging Atman. And so he lays out what are the possible candidates for this unchanging Atman. Say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And he says 1 fails, 2 fails, 3 fails, 4 fails, 5 fail. They all fail. So if there is something like this Atman that the Hindu faith says, it should be one of these 4 or 5. He said there isn't one of the 4 or 5, which means there isn't one. And that's an argument. That's a form of logical syllogism, right? And you can use Buddhist writings, use Hindu writings to make arguments. Hindus give arguments for why this is that. They give arguments for their pantheism. They're engaged in argument. They're engaged in logic, which means that logic is neither Western or Eastern. It's not Aristotelian or non-Aristotelian. So we're not choosing a certain kind of logic. Logic is just logic. The next objection that you might be thinking, well, people just are not logical. People aren't logical. People don't buy into the logical, so why even bother? Right? Why should I be logical when no one else is going to be logical? What's the point? Right? Well, the reply to that is people are often not moral either. Right? People are often not kind. Does that mean you shouldn't be kind? Does that mean you shouldn't be moral? Right? Why bother being good if no one else is good? Well, it's pretty juvenile. Right? Why? Because it doesn't. We teach our kids this. Well, just because if everyone's jumping off the bridge, does that mean you jump off? Of course not. Everyone else is smoking. Does that mean you should smoke? Well, of course not. Right? So it's just because people are not logical doesn't mean that you shouldn't be logical. And there are people who are logical. Right? Logic works on people who are logical. So that's pretty easy to spell. Right? People aren't moral either, but you should still be moral. And being moral makes you happier. Being moral makes you better. Well, being logical makes you better. Being logical makes you happier. Okay, next objection. Well, why should I bother with logic? Because not everything deals with logic. You're going to use logic to express to capture how you love somebody. Can you use logic to say the things that are in the heart, right? Those sorts of things. And it reminds me of this one, I think there was a ballet dancer. This ballet dancer was doing this beautiful dance, and after the thing was over, some interviewer, some journalist came up and asked her, what were you trying to say with that ballet, with that dance? And of course the dancer said, well, if I could have said it, I wouldn't have danced. Right. My love for my wife and my children goes beyond logic. That's totally true. Logic can't capture those sorts of things. But just because it can't capture it doesn't mean that logic doesn't have something to say about it, right? So if I say that I have my love for my wife, I want my love not to be my hate, right? Love should not be non-love, right? I don't want contradictory love. I don't want irrational love. I don't want illogical love, right? Young love sometimes is illogical, sometimes is irrational, and that does not go well. So although love, the expression of love, the feeling of love is just an example of something that logic can't deal with, it doesn't mean that logic can't deal with it at all. Of course, your love should be rational and logical and coherent and intelligible and all those sorts of things. So just because it goes beyond logic doesn't mean it's less than logic, for sure. Okay, so why should we study logic? It's unavoidable, right? You're listening to the Thomistic Mind broadcast with Dr. Reed, where we discuss, right, philosophy and theology for the purposes of finding truth. And I teach philosophy to seminarians at Divine Word College. I love teaching at Divine Word. I have wonderful students. I also teach those in the Permanent Diaconate Program for Archdiocese of Dubuque. And they hear a lot of this stuff. I tend to let them have it about the philosophy. And so we're talking about logic here as we wrap up. We're talking about logic and why, kind of what it is, the ordering of it, how logic is found in certain things. So wherever there's order, there's going to be a kind of logic. Right? There is a kind of logic to, say, playing a sport. There is a kind of logic when it comes to shingling a roof. There is a kind of logic when it comes to building a home. There is a kind of logic when it comes to installing plumbing, all those sorts of things. Right? There is a sort of logic when you're decorating. Right? There is a certain logic when you're organizing, so on and so on and so on. Right? All policies. Right? You have policy because you're trying to bring order to the place that either you work or that you study, and so on and so forth. So then I looked at some of the reasons to study logic. One is it's just unavoidable. You can't avoid logic. It's every thought you have. It's in every idea you've ever pondered. It's in every decision you've ever made. It's in decisions that you haven't made. Logic is grounded in the very fabric of reality. It's in the very fabric of being. To be is to be logical. Right? The Lord himself is logic. He is the reason. He's the ordering. And it works. Right? Logic does work. I mean, if you get good at logic, if you get good at being logical, you can persuade people. You can be successful. And you can live better because you make better decisions. So logic works. Very much. And then we looked at one of the objections. Well, aren't you just using Aristotelian and Western logic? And I said, no, there's no such thing as just Aristotelian and Western logic. There's just logic. The East uses it, right? I talked about how the Buddhist and the Hindu, they have arguments that follow the same logical principles and modes of inference that Aristotle would use, right? It's just a mistruth or an error to say that Aristotle invented logic. He did no such thing. He discovered logic. Just because logic might be used in a Western setting, in a more Western university, doesn't mean that that's property of the West. No, the logic is something that all sciences, all societies, every single mind uses, embraces. So we're not choosing it, right? Just logic is logic. Well, people are illogical. We talked about that, right? Well, why bother? People are not logical, right? I can hear some of my students saying that, right? Well, people aren't good either, right? Lots of people are immoral. Lots of people are cruel. So why bother? Well, because the cruelty is a sort of irrational, and that is not going to go well, right? Being logical for you, right, makes you happier and makes you more successful, and it makes you more human in a way, right? So of course you should be logical, even if everyone's not. Logic doesn't deal with everything, right? There are things that go beyond logic. Conceded. I will concede that. Of course, there's some things that go beyond logic. Love goes beyond logic. Forgiveness goes beyond logic. Feelings go beyond logic. Intuitions go beyond logic, of course. But they're not less than the kinds of things that logic can deal with, right? Logic does deal with love, does deal with intuitions. Although logic would be unable to express those things, right? Logic wouldn't be able to express the truth fully of love. But you want to have rational love. You want to have, coherent love. You want to have love that's intelligible. You want to have love, at least you want to be able to write about it, those sorts of things. Okay, so we have just about a minute and a half left. And so what we'll be doing next time, our next episode, we will be looking at logic and God. We're going to start up with logic and God. For asking questions like, does using logic put our reason above God? That's a good question, right? Is being logical, so if I think something's logical, does that mean I'm like judging God? And like a related question, does using logic subject God to our logic? Right? Seems like you want to be able to say that God isn't subject to our logic. Maybe does God transcend logic? Right? Isn't using logic another problem? Isn't just rationalism? Isn't just you're just using logic just if it isn't logical? It's like kind of like a Spock, right? That sort of thing. And moreover, there's theological reasons to say, God's not limited by logic, right? God can break the laws of logic, right? There are Christian doctrines that involve logical contradiction, the Trinity, the Incarnation, predestination. I mean, aren't miracles kind of illogical? All that sort of stuff. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going to leave off today. I'm going to end today's episode with those thoughts. And this is the Thomistic Mind, right? This is the Thomistic Mind. This is episode 6. I am Dr. Reed. I am your sort of guide into the world of philosophy, into the world of logic. And so I really hope that these episodes have, they've meant something to you. I hope that these have been an encouragement to you, that they have sort of, spawned some sort of desire to be more philosophical, to be more logical, to keep listening, because, it's great to be philosophical. It's wonderful to learn logic, and we're just going to pick it up from here. Next time, we're going to dive more into logic, talking about the laws of thought and inferences. So please stay with us, and I'll see you next time. You've been listening to The Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed, produced by Mr. Matt Graham. To learn more about our rigorous philosophy courses, visit us online at www.reedthomas.com, www.reedthomist.com. It's been a privilege to journey with you through the world of philosophy, seeking truth, goodness, and beauty together. My hope is that today's conversation encourages you to think more deeply, live more wisely,
and love more fully. Until next time, keep your mind fixed on the truth and your heart set on the highest good.